3 weeks before signing the biggest deal in company history, the CEO fired me. He said exactly one thing before signing my termination papers: game over. 3 months later, he sat in his empty office, watching his client list disappear line by line, and couldn't figure out what the hell had just happened. My name is Quinn Foster, and for 8 years, I was the invisible architect behind Sterling Ventures' most lucrative deals. At 38, I'd built a reputation in New York's cutthroat venture capital scene that most people spend decades trying to achieve. While others chased headlines in corner offices, I chased relationships. Trust was my currency, and I'd amassed a fortune of it. Sterling Ventures wasn't just another VC firm throwing money at startups. We hunted big game, acquisition deals that reshaped entire industries. My latest prey was a $1.8 billion acquisition of Genentech Dynamics, a tech conglomerate that every firm on Wall Street wanted a piece of. For 18 months, I'd cultivated every connection, memorized every decision-maker's golf handicap, their kids' names, their favorite whiskey. I didn't just know their business, I knew their fears, their ambitions, their breaking points. The New York investment scene is a peculiar ecosystem. It runs on two things: astronomical amounts of money and microscopically small amounts of trust. Betray someone once, and you might as well move to Montana and raise cattle. That's why what happened next was so perfectly ruthless and so perfectly stupid. Mason Caldwell had been CEO of Sterling for 5 years. At 47, he wore his insecurity like an expensive suit, tailored to hide the flaws but obvious to anyone who looked closely. Mason had the pedigree: Harvard MBA, Goldman Sachs alumni, the right country club membership. What he didn't have was the ability to make people want to pick up his calls. That's where I came in. While Mason glad-handed at charity galas, I was having 2 a.m. strategy sessions with CTOs in Tokyo. While he practiced his CNBC soundbites, I was dissecting financial models with CFOs who trusted me with information they wouldn't tell their own boards. Every major deal Sterling closed in the last 5 years had my fingerprints all over it, even if Mason's signature was on the contracts. The Genentech acquisition was my masterpiece. I'd spent months turning their initial skepticism into cautious interest, then genuine enthusiasm. The due diligence alone had taken 6 months, navigating regulatory hurdles that would have killed lesser deals. By the time we were 3 weeks from signing, I'd choreographed every detail. The financing was secured, the board approvals lined up like dominoes, the press release drafted. That's when I noticed the shift. Mason started scheduling meetings without me. Legal documents began circulating with my name conspicuously absent from the distribution list. When I asked about the signing ceremony logistics, his assistant fumbled with excuses about keeping it small. I'd been in this business long enough to read the writing on the wall. Mason wasn't planning to share the spotlight, he was planning to steal it entirely. The only question was whether he'd wait until after the ink dried, or if he'd be bold enough to cut me out before. As it turned out, Mason Caldwell was bolder than I'd given him credit for, and that would be his downfall. The ambush came on a Tuesday morning. I'd arrived early, as usual, to prep for a final stakeholder call with Genentech's board. My assistant met me at the elevator, her face carefully neutral, the expression she wore when delivering news that would ruin someone's day. "Mason wants to see you in the main conference room," she said. "The entire leadership team is there." I knew before I walked through those glass doors. 20 years in this business teaches you to smell blood in the water. The conference room was full, Mason at the head of the table, flanked by our CFO, general counsel, and the entire executive committee. No one made eye contact except Mason, who wore the satisfied smirk of a mediocre chess player who thinks he's just executed a brilliant gambit. "Quinn," he said, gesturing to the only empty chair, positioned like a defendant's seat, "we need to discuss the company's restructuring." Restructuring, the corporate world's favorite euphemism for backstabbing. I sat down, maintaining the poker face that had served me through $1,000-a-second negotiations. I wasn't aware we were restructuring 3 weeks before closing the Genentech deal. Mason's smirk widened. That's exactly why we need to restructure. This deal has shown us some inefficiencies in our current structure, redundancies. The word hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Around the table, my supposed colleagues studied their phones, their coffee cups, anything but my face. These were people I'd brought into deals, whose bonuses I'd secured, whose careers I'd elevated. Their silence was deafening. Let me be direct, Mason continued, sliding a folder across the table. Your position is being eliminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you out after you sign these papers. I opened the folder. Termination agreement, non-compete clause. And buried on page 3, the real knife. Forfeiture of all commissions and bonuses related to pending deals, including Gentech. You're firing me 3 weeks before I close a $1.8 billion deal? I kept my voice level, almost curious. The company is closing the deal. Mason corrected. You've done your part. Now it's time for executive leadership to take over. I almost laughed. Mason couldn't close a dinner reservation without 3 assistants and a PowerPoint deck. But I saw the calculation in his eyes. He'd convinced himself that with the deal this far along, momentum would carry it home. All the relationships I'd built, the trust I'd earned, he thought it transferred with the Sterling Ventures letterhead. Sign the papers, Quinn. His tone had shifted from corporate speak to something harder. Your keycard is already deactivated. Your company email was suspended an hour ago. This isn't a negotiation. I looked around the room one more time. Not one person would meet my eyes. Even Jennifer, whom I'd mentored from analyst to VP, stared at her laptop screen like it contained the secrets of the universe. You know what, Mason? I stood up, leaving the folder untouched. You're right. This isn't a negotiation. His face flickered with uncertainty. He'd expected tears, maybe anger, possibly begging. Calm acceptance wasn't in his playbook. You're going to sign those papers, he said. But the commanding tone had cracks in it. No, I said simply. I'm not. You want to fire me? Fine, that's your prerogative. But I'm not signing away my rights to save you the embarrassment of what you're doing. And Mason? I leaned in slightly, just enough to make him pull back. Game's not over. It hasn't even started. Security appeared at the door, 2 guards I'd chatted with every morning for 8 years. They looked apologetic as they flanked me. I gathered my personal items under their watch. A photo of my sister, my favorite coffee mug. 8 years condensed into a banker's box. As we waited for the elevator, one of the guards, Tony, whispered, "This is bullshit, Ms. Foster. Everyone knows it." I smiled, the first genuine expression I'd allowed myself all morning. Thanks, Tony. Take care of yourself. The elevator doors closed on Sterling Ventures, on 8 years of my life, on a $1.8 billion deal that had my DNA in every detail. But as I walked through the lobby, past the reception desk where I'd welcomed countless clients, I felt something unexpected, not anger, not despair, anticipation. Because Mason Caldwell had just made the kind of mistake that ends careers, destroys companies, and becomes a cautionary tale at business schools. He'd confused proximity to power with actual power. He'd mistaken the throne for the kingdom. And he was about to learn that in this business, you're only as good as your last phone call. And nobody was going to answer his. The first week after Sterling, I did what any strategic thinker would do. Nothing. I sat in my Manhattan apartment, phone switched off, watching the city move below like a chessboard where every piece had its purpose. The calls started within hours of my exit. Recruiters, competitors, journalists sniffing for gossip. I ignored them all. Revenge, like any good acquisition, requires due diligence. Instead, I made lists. Who at Sterling had looked away in that conference room? Who had stayed silent? More importantly, who had benefited from my sudden departure? The patterns emerged quickly. Mason had promoted 3 VPs in the past month, all positions that would intersect with the Gentech deal. He'd been planning this for weeks, maybe months. But Mason had made a fundamental error, the kind they warn you about in first-year business school. He'd focused on the structure, not the foundation. And I was the foundation. On day 8, I made my first move, not to Gentech, that would be too obvious. Instead, I called Patricia Wong, CEO of Meridian Capital. 2 years ago, I'd saved her firm from a hostile takeover by architecting a white knight deal that kept her in control. She owed me nothing. In this business, past favors have a short half-life. But Patricia understood something Mason didn't. Reputation is currency. And I'd just had mine publicly devalued. "Quinn," she said after one ring. "I was wondering when you'd call." "I need a favor," I said. "No," she corrected. "You need a platform. I need someone who actually knows how to close deals. Let's stop pretending this is charity." Within an hour, I had a new email address, a consulting agreement with Meridian, and something more valuable than both: market credibility. Patricia didn't just hire me, she sent an email to her entire network announcing my new role as Senior Strategic Advisor. By lunch, half of Wall Street knew I was back in play. The intelligence gathering came next. Over coffee with former Sterling employees who'd left for greener pastures, I learned about Mason's promises to Gentech. He'd guaranteed regulatory approvals I knew were impossible without specific connections. He'd promised integration synergies based on my analysis, but without understanding the underlying assumptions. Most damaging, he'd hinted at privileged information about Gentech's competitors, information that didn't exist. My phone rang constantly now, but I only answered select calls. David Kim from Gentech reached out on day 12, his voice careful, probing. "Quinn, we heard about the changes at Sterling. We're concerned about continuity." "As you should be," I said. "David, can I be frank? The deal structure I built has 17 critical dependencies. How many do you think Mason understands?" The silence stretched. Then, "Would you be available for an unofficial consultation?" "I'm afraid my non-compete prevents me from working on any Sterling deals." I lied smoothly. I'd signed nothing, but let Mason sweat when that got back to him. "However, I'd be happy to discuss your general M&A strategy. Say, Thursday at 2. The real preparation happened at night. I incorporated Foster Strategic Advisory, LLC, registering it in Delaware with the kind of structure that whispered serious business. I didn't need office space. In post-COVID New York, power wasn't about corner offices anymore. It was about who answered when you called. And I called everyone. Not about Gentech, not directly. Just touching base, grabbing coffee, discussing market trends. Each conversation planted seeds. Sterling seems distracted lately. Mason's team looks overwhelmed. Heard they're having issues with the Gentech integration planning. Nothing actionable, nothing libelous. Just observations from a concerned industry veteran. Marcus Chen, no relation despite the name, my former analyst who jumped to Blackstone, gave me the most valuable intelligence. Mason's been calling our senior partners directly. 3 times last week. He sounds desperate. Perfect. By week 3, I'd assembled my war council. Not employees, I didn't need overhead. Instead, I had a network of free agents, each exceptional in their niche. A regulatory expert who owed me for an SEC introduction. An integration specialist I'd helped land at McKinsey. A media strategist who remembered when I'd killed a story about her client's divorce affecting stock prices. I'm not asking anyone to do anything unethical. I told them in our first video call, I'm asking you to be available when opportunity knocks. And it's going to knock very, very soon. The final piece of preparation was psychological. I pulled Mason's last 5 deals, analyzing his patterns when under pressure. He always did 3 things: overpromised to buy time, blamed subordinates when things went south, and, this was the critical weakness, he got creative with facts when cornered. Creative facts in a $1.8 billion deal weren't just mistakes. They were potential fraud. I smiled, closing my laptop. Tomorrow would mark exactly 1 month since my termination. Mason probably thought he was in the clear. the deal moving toward closing. He had no idea he was already bleeding out. He just hadn't looked down yet. The first crack in Mason's facade appeared during a routine due diligence call. I wasn't on it, of course, but David Kim was kind enough to have lunch with me afterward, purely social, naturally. Your old team seems overwhelmed, he mentioned casually over sushi. Mason promised us regulatory clearance by next week, but when we asked for specifics, he kept referring to conversations with regulators that we can't verify. I set down my chopsticks carefully. David, you know I can't comment on Sterling's operations. Of course not, he agreed. But hypothetically, if someone were making promises about regulatory approvals without proper foundation, hypothetically, that would be concerning. The SEC takes misrepresentation in major acquisitions very seriously. David's expression shifted. The seed was planted. Within days, the questions from Gentech to Sterling multiplied. Where were the promised regulatory pre-clearances? Why were integration timelines suddenly extending? Who exactly was managing stakeholder relationships now? Each query required Mason to tap dance harder, make bigger promises, dig deeper holes. Then Blackwell Holdings made their move. Patricia Wong had connected me with their CEO, James Blackwell, a week earlier. Blackwell had been Sterling's cornerstone LP for a decade, but they'd grown frustrated with Mason's communication style. When James called me, he was direct. We're hearing concerning things about the Gentech deal. As Sterling's largest investor, we need clarity. Would you consider an advisory role? I'm flattered, James, but that would put me in an awkward position given my recent departure. What if it wasn't about Sterling? What if we wanted your perspective on our entire portfolio strategy? By the end of the week, Foster Strategic Advisory had its first major client. The press release was carefully worded. No mention of Sterling, just a strategic partnership between FSA and one of New York's most prestigious investment firms. But everyone in our incestuous little world knew what it meant. Blackwell was hedging their bets. Mason's response was predictable. He called an emergency all-hands at Sterling, according to Jennifer, who'd finally worked up the courage to text me. His message was vintage Mason. Everything was fine. The deal was on track. Ignore the disgruntled former employees spreading rumors. But panic has a smell, and Sterling reeked of it. The real damage came from an unexpected source. Lisa Park, Gentech's general counsel, reached out directly. We'd worked together on 3 deals over the years, and she didn't mince words. Quinn, I need to know if you were involved in the regulatory strategy Mason's been pitching us. I can't discuss Sterling's internal strategies. Lisa, that's answer enough, she said. We're initiating an independent review of all representations made during negotiations. If you receive any legal documents, you'll cooperate? Fully. The investigation threat sent Mason into overdrive. He flew to Gentech's headquarters uninvited, demanded meetings with board members, made increasingly wild promises about post-merger synergies. Each desperate move only confirmed what the market was beginning to whisper. Sterling was losing control of its biggest deal. Then I played my ace. During my final weeks at Sterling, I'd noticed Mason adding a new law firm to the deal team, not for their expertise, but because the senior partner belonged to his golf club. I'd warned against it. The firm had no experience with deals this size. Mason had overruled me. Now, that firm made a critical error. They filed regulatory documents with the wrong federal district, causing a 2-week delay in approval processes. A fixable mistake, but in a timeline this tight, potentially fatal. I made sure David Kim heard about it within an hour. Not from me directly, that would be too obvious. Instead, from a regulatory consultant who happened to work with both Gentech and my new advisory firm. The Sterling team filed in the 2nd district instead of the 3rd. The consultant explained to David, coincidentally while I was in the room for an entirely unrelated matter. Classic rookie mistake. Someone should have caught that. David's face went through several expressions before landing on fury. Someone like their former head of business development? I couldn't possibly comment, I said. That evening, Gentech's board held an emergency session. The agenda, leaked to the Financial Times within hours, had only one item: review of Sterling Ventures partnership status. Mason called me that night. First time since the firing, I let it go to voicemail. "Quinn, it's Mason." His voice had lost its polish. "We need to talk. Professional courtesy. Call me back." I deleted the message and poured myself a glass of wine. Professional courtesy? That ship hadn't just sailed, I'd personally set it on fire and pushed it out to sea. The next morning, 3 more Sterling clients called me. "Just checking in," they said. "Just wondering about my availability for strategic consultations." The kind of calls that meant they were one bad headline away from jumping ship. I gave them all the same answer: "I'm happy to discuss your strategic needs. Fair warning, though, my dance card is filling up quickly." Because the kill shot was coming, Mason just didn't know from which direction yet. The kill shot came in the form of a breakfast meeting at the St. Regis. David Kim had requested it personally, and he'd brought Gentek's CEO, Sarah Winters, and their head of M&A. The power trio sat across from me, their faces carefully neutral. "Let's skip the pleasantries," Sarah said, cutting into her eggs Benedict. "We're 48 hours from either signing with Sterling or walking away. David says you might have insights that could influence our decision." I set down my coffee cup. "Sarah, I built every relationship, every term sheet, every strategic rationale for this deal. I know it better than anyone alive, but more importantly, I know what Mason Caldwell has been telling you versus what he can actually deliver. Go on." "He promised you regulatory approval by last week. You don't have it. He guaranteed key personnel would transition from our portfolio companies to ensure integration. He can't deliver that. I was the one with those relationships. He told you Sterling's LPs were fully aligned, yet Blackwell Holdings, your biggest co-investor, just hired me to review their entire portfolio strategy." Sarah and David exchanged glances. "You're saying the deal is dead?" "I'm saying the deal with Sterling is dead. The acquisition itself, that's very much alive. The question is who shepherds it home." "You have a proposal," David stated. I slid a folder across the table. "Meridian Capital, with Foster Strategic Advisory as lead strategic advisor. Same terms, better execution, and most importantly, the relationships and expertise that actually matter. Every regulatory contact, every integration specialist, every stakeholder who trusts the messenger as much as the message." Sarah flipped through the documents. "This is essentially the same deal structure you built at Sterling. Because it's the right structure, the difference is who's executing it. Mason is currently on his 3rd law firm, his 2nd regulatory consultant, and his 4th integration plan. He's burning through resources trying to recreate what I built. Meanwhile, your timeline is evaporating." "And if we stay with Sterling," David asked, "then you'll close eventually. Maybe, after another 3 months of delays, cost overruns, and integration nightmares. Mason will blame everyone except himself. Your board will question why you stuck with a clearly failing partner. And the market will remember this as the deal that almost killed Gentek's expansion plans." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then, "What about legal ramifications? Sterling could sue." "For what?" "I signed no non-compete. I've stolen no documents. I've made no false statements. I've simply made myself available to the market. And the market has responded. If Mason wants to explain to a judge why his hand-picked team couldn't execute a deal I designed, he's welcome to try." The meeting ended with handshakes and promises to review internally. But I saw it in their eyes. The decision was already made. That afternoon, I got a call from Sterling's general counsel. They were considering legal action. He warned, tortious interference, breach of fiduciary duty, whatever they could make stick. "Michael," I said pleasantly, before you go down that road, you might want to check Mason's emails to Gentek's board, specifically the ones where he claimed to have regulatory pre-approval that didn't exist, and the ones guaranteeing personnel transfers he had no authority to promise. Discovery works both ways." The line went quiet. Then, We'd prefer to resolve this without litigation. So would I. Here's my suggestion. Sterling walks away gracefully, issues a statement about strategic realignment, or whatever helps Mason save face. Gentech moves forward with their new partners. Everyone keeps their reputation intact. And if Mason refuses, then I suppose we'll all learn exactly how many misrepresentations he made during negotiations. The SEC loves a good fraud investigation, don't they? 48 hours later, the press release hit. Gentech was restructuring their acquisition approach, partnering with Meridian Capital for enhanced execution capabilities. Sterling Ventures wished all parties well in their future endeavors. The real story spread through private channels within hours. Quinn Foster had just orchestrated the smoothest hostile takeover of a deal in M&A history. Without firing a shot, without stealing a document, without violating a single law. I'd transferred a $1.8 billion transaction from the firm that fired me to their biggest competitor. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia Wong. Beautiful work, dinner at Daniel to celebrate? I typed back, rain check. I have 17 more Sterling clients to call. Because Mason thought he'd fired one employee. In reality, he'd declared war on the person who knew where all his bodies were buried. And I was just getting started. The unraveling of Sterling Ventures took exactly 93 days. I know because I marked each one on my calendar, not out of spite, but from professional curiosity. How long does it take a venerable firm to implode when its foundation gets ripped away? The first dominoes fell quietly. 2 weeks after losing Gentech, Sterling's second biggest deal, a $400 million acquisition I'd been nurturing for months, suddenly developed concerns about execution capability. The client, naturally, reached out to foster strategic advisory for a second opinion. I advised them, quite honestly, that their concerns were well-founded. By week 3, the bleeding became arterial. 5 key accounts requested portfolio reviews. Sterling's team, already stretched thin trying to salvage Gentech, couldn't handle the scrutiny. Junior staff started updating LinkedIn profiles. Senior VPs took long lunches that turned into afternoon interviews. Jennifer called me on a Saturday. "It's chaos," she said. "Mason's in the office 18 hours a day, screaming at everyone. 3 MDs quit yesterday. He's telling the remaining team it's temporary, just market volatility." "That's all here. And what are you telling yourself?" I asked. "That I should have spoken up in that conference room." "No," I said firmly. "You should have left years ago. But it's not too late. Send me your resume." The death blow came from an unexpected angle. The SEC, acting on what they called credible whistleblower information, opened an investigation into Sterling's representations during the Gentech negotiations. I had nothing to do with the complaint directly. But when federal investigators start asking why a CEO promised regulatory approvals that didn't exist, people talk. And when people talk, they mention the executive who actually knew how to get those approvals, and why she was mysteriously fired 3 weeks before the deal's completion. Mason tried damage control. He hired crisis management consultants, issued statements about meritless accusations, even attempted a charm offensive with remaining clients. But you can't charm your way out of federal investigation, and you can't spin your way back to credibility when the market smells blood. The client exodus accelerated, 12 accounts in week 6, 8 more in week 7. Each departure leaked to the press, creating a drumbeat of headlines. Sterling Ventures loses another major client became as regular as morning coffee. Then Blackwell Holdings dropped the hammer. As Sterling's largest LP, they called for an emergency board meeting. Their agenda was simple: leadership change or complete withdrawal of funding. Mason fought back, tried to blame market conditions, rogue employees, even me. But numbers don't lie, and Sterling's numbers were catastrophic. 60% revenue drop in 2 months. Deal pipeline emptier than a weekend subway car. The board meeting lasted 7 hours. Mason emerged unemployed, but the damage was irreversible. Interim leadership couldn't stem the bleeding. Who wants to trust their billions to a firm whose CEO was under SEC investigation? whose biggest deals evaporated, whose best people had fled to competitors. Sterling's death rattle came on a Thursday. An all-staff email announced they were exploring strategic alternatives. Wall Street speak for looking for someone to buy our corpse. No buyers emerged. Why pay for a damaged brand when you could just hire their refugees? The bankruptcy filing made the front page of the Financial Times. Sterling Ventures collapses in wake of leadership crisis. The article mentioned the Gentech debacle, the SEC investigation, the client exodus. My name appeared once neutrally, as former head of business development who left shortly before troubles began. I read it over breakfast at my new corner office. Meridian had insisted on proper space for their star rainmaker. The Gentech deal had closed flawlessly, 2 weeks ahead of schedule. 3 more Sterling clients had followed me to Meridian. My compensation package made my Sterling salary look like pocket change. That afternoon, I received a package, no return address, but I recognized Jennifer's handwriting. Inside was a photo from Sterling's last holiday party, the entire team, champagne raised, Mason at the center, grinning like he owned the world. Jennifer had drawn an arrow pointing to where I stood in the back, nearly cropped out of frame. Her note was simple. You were never in the background. He just couldn't see it. I studied the photo, then dropped it in my trash. The past was done. Sterling Ventures was a name for business school case studies now. A cautionary tale about hubris and the price of betraying the people who build your success. My assistant knocked. Ms. Foster, your 3 o'clock is here. The Sovereign Wealth Fund from Singapore? I smoothed my jacket and stood. Another deal, another opportunity, another chance to build something Mason could never understand. Lasting value based on trust, expertise, and the knowledge that in this business, you're only as good as the people you choose to betray. Sterling Ventures died owing $847 million to creditors. Mason Caldwell's personal assets were frozen pending investigation. And I never thought about him again. 6 months after Sterling's bankruptcy, I was reviewing quarterlies in my office when my assistant interrupted. Ms. Foster, there's a gentleman here without an appointment. Says he's an old colleague. Tom Morrison? Tom. Sterling's former head of research, one of the few good ones who'd gotten out early. I had him sent in. He looked tired but relieved, like a man who'd survived a hurricane. Quinn, sorry to drop by unannounced. I'm at Silverman Partners now. Congratulations, I said, gesturing to a chair. What brings you here? A proposal, actually. Silverman's looking at acquiring some of Sterling's remaining assets, mainly their research division and some proprietary analytics. Clean assets, no legal complications. We need someone who understands their real value. I smiled. Even in death, Sterling was still creating opportunities. Send me the details, I'll review them. There's one more thing. Tom hesitated. Mason called me last week. From what I hear, he's trying to start a new fund. Wants to rebuild his legacy or something. He asked if I knew how to reach you. And I told him I didn't have your current number. Tom shrugged. Figured you'd changed it. I hadn't, but I appreciated the loyalty. Thank you, Tom. After he left, I walked to my window, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. Somewhere out there, Mason Caldwell was cold calling potential investors, trying to resurrect a career built on other people's work. He'd learned what I'd known all along. In this business, your reputation is your real currency. And he'd bankrupted his. My phone buzzed. A text from David Kim. Just closed our 3rd acquisition using your integration framework. Dinner next week to discuss the 4th? Another from Patricia Wong. Singapore deal closed. Your bonus just hit 7 figures. Drinks tonight? And one from Jennifer, now thriving at a boutique firm. Remember that analyst Mason hired to replace you? He just applied here. I enjoyed declining his application. I turned back to my desk, where a framed quote sat next to my monitor, something my mentor told me years ago. Trust takes years to build, seconds to break, and forever to repair. Mason had broken trust with the one person who'd built his empire. He'd confused the throne for the kingdom, the title for the power. Real power isn't about corner offices or org charts. It's about the phone calls that get returned, the deals that close because someone believes your word, the loyalty that follows you regardless of letterhead. 3 weeks. That's all the time Mason thought he needed to steal my work and claim my victory. He'd fired me believing I was expendable, that relationships were transferable, that trust could be inherited like office furniture. Instead, he learned the hardest lesson in business. When you betray the architect, don't be surprised when the whole building comes down. My assistant knocked again. Your 4 o'clock is here, the pension fund from Toronto? I closed my laptop and stood, straightening my jacket. Another day, another deal, another chance to build something valuable. The game Mason thought he'd ended, it was just beginning, and I was winning. Thank you so much for listening to this story of corporate revenge and justice. I'm curious. Where are you listening to this story from? Please share in the comments below so we can connect with revenge story lovers from around the world. If you enjoyed this tale of how one woman brought down an entire company after being betrayed, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts. Have you ever experienced workplace betrayal? How did you handle it? Let's discuss in the comments.